What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. Today I'm very excited to announce that we are going to be relaunching our League of Legends Moments channel with some new, fresh, and exciting content. We took a break from posting League content from this channel to explore other games for a little bit, but we've decided we want to stick to League of Legends on this channel for the long-term future. Check it out and subscribe at the link in the description. We'll be doing videos of the best League of Legends moments, highlights, and clips from the community, and even a couple new topics that are definitely going to be really exciting. We'll be bringing our moment style of content back to League of Legends and making tons of videos for you guys. Of course, I understand that not all of you are going to be interested in this, which is exactly why we're doing it on an entirely separate channel. If you want to check it out, you can subscribe at the link in the description. So most of the time I spend looking and kind of researching for scrapped abilities is when there's like a new rework or a new champion coming out, and a lot of writers will share some of the interesting mechanics they tested out for the new character but decided not to keep. And a lot of those abilities end up being really modern, but there's of course quite a lot of really old scrapped kits and abilities from back when League of Legends was in alpha and beta. Now most of these abilities were actually discovered by data mining the game files way back in the day, and they show us how different some champions could have ended up being. Of course there's no champion in the game that is the same today as they were back in beta, but it's interesting to look at the original design ideas as a way to get some insight into the early days of Riot. And to be clear, these are gameplay kits that never actually made it into the game. It's not the kits that were in beta but then got changed later on. And if you enjoyed the video, definitely leave a like on it or let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for some more videos. So the first one we're taking a look at today is actually an early version of Nasus that had an extremely different kit to what was eventually released. The abilities and themes were all somewhat similar, but he actually had this crazy passive that his entire kit was designed around, called Soul Nexus, which gave him a new soul every 15, 10, or 5 seconds depending on his level. He'd actually have to use these souls to cast his abilities, but holding on to them would instead give him a bunch of extra health regen for each soul that he had stored, up to a cap of 6. Nowadays, this might be considered kind of a terrible design because you're basically forcing players to avoid using their abilities. That's probably why it was changed before release. His Siphoning Strike and Spirit Fire were similar to today's versions, with Siphoning Strike giving him an extra soul and Spirit Fire costing 1 soul to cast. Wither was also on this kit, costing 2 souls to cast and lasting a total of 6 seconds, so much longer. It reduced attack speed and movement speed by a set percentage, but then it actually also reduced the target's move speed and attack speed by an additional 10% every second for the duration of the ability. From a counterplay perspective, that's pretty rough to deal with. The biggest change was his ultimate though, Avatar of Death, which cost 4 souls to cast. Nasus would assume his true god form as the god of death for 20 seconds, giving him a bunch of health and attack speed. Any nearby enemy units that died would also explode, dealing extra magic damage to nearby enemies. At this point in time, Nasus also actually had a 5th ability, which we can only guess was available during his ultimate. It was called March of the Damned, and it would release all of Nasus's stacked up souls in a torrent of damaged spirits, dealing a bunch of magic damage for each soul that he had stacked up. So it turns out Nasus could have had a completely different game design, and I would kind of like to see this sort of mechanic tested a little bit more, but I have to say that it does seem to have a lot of reasons for why it was removed for sure. Next up, we've got a cancelled version of Lee Sin, who had completely different abilities. Now this is back when he was being developed as the Blind Monk character, which was actually cancelled in development, but then revived actually many years later and released as Lee Sin. Now there's no specific information about what his abilities did, but from the names and image icons we can take a really educated guess, because League of Legends has been pretty consistent with the names of abilities and the icons kind of hinting at what they did. So his first ability was called Blinding Strike, and it was probably Lee Sin's Q, so our guess was that it was a pretty simple damage tool that gave a similar kind of effect to Graves' smokescreen, or perhaps just blinding them like maybe Teemo's Q. His W at the time was actually Fists of Fury, which is an attack speed buff, given the similarities in theme between it and the name of his current passive, Flurry. His E was Hardiness, which as the name implies was most likely some kind of defensive tool, like a shield or some extra resistances. He was always meant to be a brawler, so it makes sense for him to be able to shrug off damage in some sort of way. His ultimate at the time was Mystic Meditation, with an icon kind of showing his hands clasped together. I gotta say, your guess for this one is as good as mine, but there seems to be some kind of fiery energy coming off his hands, so maybe it was like some kind of super buff, or maybe something like Master Yi's meditation on steroids, like it immobilizes him but then gives him a ton of healing, damage resistance, and bonus stats. Anyway, last up is what appears to be his passive, which was Sight Unseeing. Thematically, this was probably meant to explain how he fights while being blind, but I'm not entirely sure what it would have meant in terms of gameplay. If you have any ideas about what those abilities might have been, definitely let us know in the comments below. Similar to Lee Sin's scrapped abilities, we also have a list of ability names and icons for Ashe that were changed on release. First up is her Q aimed shot, which was most likely a single straight line skill shot, or something similar. Next was her W, which was Pierce Armor, which as the name implies probably gave Ashe some extra armor penetration, maybe as a passive ability that scaled up with the ability level, or as an active that she would have to use to gain that buff. Then there's E, which was Double Shot, which actually sounds very similar to an early version of her volley ability, but just less dramatic with only 2 shots. And her ultimate was really weird though. It was called Crazy Dance, and the icon just shows Ashe holding a bow. Again, I've got not that much of an idea of what this ability did. Probably some kind of crazy arrow spam attack. Maybe she spins and shoots an arrow in all directions or something. It's interesting that none of these abilities have any kind of ice or frost theme though. It was probably from the early days when Riot just wanted to make a ranger champion similar to the one in Dota. Last up was the original Ashe passive, which was Velocity Shot. The name kind of makes me think it gave her a super fast projectile in one of her auto attacks, maybe like the first time she fired, or maybe just gave her some bonus attack speed. However, the image shows an enemy target asleep, so maybe it was some kind of crowd control ability. It doesn't make that much sense though given the name, but the icon was maybe just a placeholder. Next up, we've got Singed, who actually has way more scrapped abilities than any other champion on our list today. So I don't know if this is because he had 2 gameplay kits in total that got cancelled, or maybe some kind of like weird alchemy kit where we would combine abilities or have multiple abilities on a single button. But let's go through them one at a time anyway. So first up, he had an ability called Burn Resistance, which, as the name implies, probably gave him some kind of immunity to damage over time effects. Then there was both Caustic Wake and Plague Wake, which were probably early versions of his Poison Trail ability. Next up is Empowered Bulwark, which actually indicates that Singed's shield might have actually had a real use sometime in his past gameplay design, rather than just being a part of his appearance like it is now. This one was almost certainly a defensive ability, especially considering he was kind of meant to be a tanky champion. Then there's Explosive Flask, which was probably a damage tool as the name implies, only to be removed when Riot decided to double down and focus on the Poison Trail gameplay. Then we have Launch Goo, which again was probably just an early version of his Mega Adhesive ability, probably very similar to it. And the last 2 abilities are Rejuvenation Potion and Alchemic Mastery. Now I'm guessing that either one of these were similar in concept to his Insanity Potion, something that just granted him a bunch of really increased combat stats and movement speed. Overall, the concept for Singed seems to have remained pretty much the same. His design was really just refined for his eventual release. Now, Sivir's early visual design, I gotta say, is pretty questionable, especially if you look at really old photos of her model, but it seems like Riot had the boomerang kind of concept pretty early on for her. Her ability icons are a little bit ambiguous, but we can definitely figure out a few things from them. So first up, she had an ability called Deadeye, showing Sivir holding her crossblade overhead. Giving the name, this was probably a damage ability that locked onto a target somehow, or it could have been an early version of her skill shot. Next up is Deadly Strikes, which seems a little bit similar to her Ricochet ability, although probably without the bouncing effect, so maybe just an attack speed steroid with some bonus damage or maybe armor penetration. Then we have Lacerate, which shows a bleeding enemy on the icon, so it's probably a damage ability, but with an added bleeding effect, maybe a bit like Old Talon or something like that, a damage over time. Next up is an ability called Spiral Blade, which was likely an area of effect type ability that made use of the boomerang niche to cause damage to a group of enemies. Maybe she throws a blade in a circle around her or something. And there's also another unnamed ability that looks a little bit like a mana potion, but it's a little bit tricky to predict what that was. It was probably just an early version of Sivir's Spell Shield, considering that would refund mana if an enemy ability hits it. Now, last on our list today, we're taking a look at Teemo, and aside from having some kind of military sort of theme to him way back in the day, or at least a much more significant military theme than he does now, He seemed completely different from the version that we actually know today in the game. His first ability was known as Bombardment, which seems to be some kind of ranged artillery strike from the image. Next up, we have Eagle Eye, which is actually a little bit confusing because it sounds like an ability that increases accuracy, but accuracy doesn't entirely exist with auto attack, so it probably gave him some kind of armor penetration or actually enhanced vision range. Next up is Mechnobot, which from the name seems to be some kind of automated friendly unit that would fight alongside you. Following that, there is Sharpshooter, another super ambiguous ability name that could honestly be one of 100 different things. I'm not really sure. It's probably something that eventually became his W, like it's a toggle effect that costs extra mana for auto attacks, but then increases maybe the damage or the armor penetration or the attack speed. And last up, we have probably the inspiration for his mushrooms, which was Tactical Strike. The ability icon shows a nuke, so it was probably just a trap that Teemo could lay down that would explode in a similar manner to his current mushrooms. It might not be really clear what all of his abilities did, but it's cool to see how he could have been different, and it definitely seems like he was always a little bit satanic. Either way, that's going to be it for today. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed this trip into the insight and design of the history of the beta of League of Legends. You know, a lot of these champions could have ended up looking quite a bit different, and I think it's fair to say that Riot has probably gotten a lot better at designing abilities from way back in the day. Definitely let us know your comments and thoughts on these kits in the comment section below, or maybe check out some of our other scrapped abilities videos if you enjoyed this one. Either way, looks like that's going to be it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe if you want, leave a like, and I'll see you guys next time.